Welcome back to Outward Home Learning. This is computer science and the topic today is IP, MAC and encryption. So we're going to go over to Mr. Holton. Now for this one I recommend you take some notes because there's a little bit more to this one because we're looking at kind of three different things. So take some notes. Over to Mr. Holton.
So IP addressing and MAC addressing are really important concepts to understand to really get to understand how data is moved about the internet. Without IP addressing and MAC addressing, you cannot move data from one point of a network to another. We're going to cover how, give you examples of each type of address and cover like difference between versioning of IP addressing and stuff like that as well. All right, let's just start off with a few examples of these so you can see them straight away. We have two versions of IP addresses now. We've got IP version 4, which is always the easiest one to remember, I think, because it's just a sequence of numbers and it will be numbers. There'll be 4 of them separated by full stops and each of the numbers will be less than 255. So that's numeric, okay? IP version 6 looks a little bit like this. It is much longer than IP version 4 and MAC addressing, which you'll see in a moment, and it's a mixture of numbers and letters. These are almost certainly not valid IP addresses. I'm just throwing out numbers and letters here just so you're aware. Okay, so now if you look at this, first off, you'll notice it's very long, especially compared to IP version 4. And that is important because we'll go on to talk about how we've run out of IP addresses or running out of IP version 4 IP addresses. It's alphanumeric as well as IP version 6, so you've got a mixture there of letters and numbers. Finally, let's give you a quick example of a MAC address. That looks a little bit like this. So you've got, again, this will be a mixture of letters and numbers, and there'll be 8 pairs separated by colons. All right, so these are what the IP addresses look like and MAC addresses look like, but we now need to understand how they are used because they're used slightly differently. And the main thing that IP addresses are used for is to route traffic around the internet. And to sort of describe this, we need just a little bit of an example. So imagine that you're at home and you are playing a game and you are playing a game with your friend in his house, okay? And so that means that data is going between your house and his, which means that data needs to somehow make its way to their house, okay? And just like if you were walking to your friend's house, that data's got loads of different routes it could possibly take. Just like you would have loads of different streets you could possibly take on the way there, and only a few of them are the right way to go. And this is what IP addresses help with. It makes sure that the data is going in the right direction. It routes data to the correct place. So your friend will have an IP address. Let's just nick the one from above. And here's your data, and your data will have your friend's IP address on it. It will be in the little packet of data that we send. And what happens is that that data makes its way onto the internet, and at each of these blue dots a question is asked, how do I get to this IP address? And it will route the data correctly based on the IP address which is in there. And like at this blue dot, for example, it will route the data this way. It will say definitely go this way along this path, don't go this way because that's not going to get you to where you want to go. And that will happen many different times until it gets to your friend's house. So it routes data to its final destination somewhere on a WAN or on the internet. MAC addresses, however, are really just concerned about getting from one little hop to the next. So these will all be local to one another. So they're used for local area networks. And this little blue dot will always have a particular MAC address. This little blue dot will always have a particular MAC address. And so they are both used to move data from here to here. So we need both, if you see. So we need an IP address to navigate you across a wide area network, whereas we need a MAC to move data from node to node locally. And because of the way these are used slightly differently, it means they've got different characteristics and they sort of end up forming opposites. So you've got IP addresses and you've got MAC addresses. So let's learn the differences between the two. IP addresses can change. So if you turn your computer on one day, you might be assigned an IP address by your internet service provider, but the next day you might get a different IP address from your internet service provider. Whereas your MAC address cannot change. It's been baked into your network interface card the moment it was created. So have a look at the hardware video if you want some information about that. But because we know it cannot change, it means it can be used to definitely identify your computer on the network. And so you hopefully get an idea that IP addresses really are software based, so they're assigned by a bit of software somewhere, whereas MAC addresses are, like I said, they're baked into the hardware, so they cannot be changed. And just a quick reminder what they do: IP addresses are used to route information across the internet or a WAN, whereas MAC addresses are used to move data between two nodes locally. The last thing to talk about is IP version 4 versus IP version 6. Why do we have these two versions? Well, quite simply, when we came up with the internet in the 80s, I mean, we as the human race, we came up with a system for identifying different websites, and we thought we'd have, I think it's 4.3 billion different IP addresses available to us, and that should be enough. But the internet kind of got popular, and 4.3 billion IP addresses is now looking like a very small number these days. We don't have enough of these to go around for all the different connected network devices we have on the internet. So IP version 6 came along. And if I remember correctly, because I had to look this up, this has got 340 undecillion addresses, which, let me tell you, I would spend a long time writing the numbers here to sort of like show how big this is. But hopefully that should be enough, definitely for our lifetimes, if not our grandchildren's lifetimes. Hopefully that'll be enough IP addresses to keep them satisfied. So that's why we have IP version 6, that's why we have IP version 4. If you remember that, if you remember the difference between IP addresses and MAC addresses, how they're used and what they look like, then you should be covered. So let's talk about encryption then, and why it's so important when you're communicating over the internet or over a network, and why it's necessary if you want to have your information protected. So it might surprise you to know that if you've got a determined attacker, so somebody who really knows what they're doing, then there's actually very little you can do to stop them from intercepting and reading any data that you send over the internet. Okay. And the reason for that is because the internet is meant to be an open system. It's meant to be easy for everyone to access information on there, but it can be abused by people. So this is our baddie in our top hat. Let's say you're trying to send a message with precious data in, I don't know, like your a password to your gaming account or something like that. It can go here, it can go on the internet. Sure, it might go to this person here, but this person down here could easily get a copy of it and then pass it on to the person it was meant to be going to without your knowledge. Okay, that's quite tricky, isn't it? So what can we do to protect against this? Well, the answer is encryption. So how can we make it so even if this person down here gets a copy of your data, they can't read it, they can't understand what's in it, and we use encryption to do that. And the principle is this: say that you have some data. So let's say I've got a word here and I'm trying to protect that data from being understood by somebody who could intercept it and attack it, because this could be like bank account details, so I'm just going for a simple word for now. What I need to do is scramble that data. And now look, there's loads of different ways of doing this, and honestly how we actually do it these days is far too complicated for me to cover in a video in a few minutes. But a very simple type of encryption which you may have come across and really does demonstrate the concept very well is something called a Caesar cipher. So this sort of is their idea. Let's say I've got a key of 2, okay, going into this. What a Caesar cipher will do is move each letter along by 2 letters of the alphabet. So H here, if you think about H, it goes H-I-J, so that would be J. E would become G. N, L would become N. N, and then Q. So that I've scrambled my data. Okay, this is now scrambled. So if somebody was to intercept that data, then there is no way that they could read it, unless of course they know the key, or they've got half an ounce of sense, because everyone knows Caesar ciphers these days. So if they use that key though, if they've got your scrambled data, they can unscramble it again, they can move those letters back by 2, and they end up with the original message. So that is what encryption does. It scrambles your data using a key. To get that data to back again, you need to use the key again, and then you can read it. And that is exactly the process which is followed when you send secure messages or important messages across the internet.
So for your first task, you need to complete the sorting task, where you'll drag and drop the statements about IP and MAC addresses into the table, and then there is a fill in the blanks task on encryption for you to complete. You're going to get about 10 minutes to complete it. If you need longer, pause the video. 10 minutes starting now. So now we are going to go over to Mr. Barnes, who's going to review those answers.
Okay, so let's have a look at this IP and MAC address activity. So it says here, sort the statements about IP and MAC addresses into the table below. And we've got IP on one side, MAC on the other. So first of all, we've got written in denary. Well, the answer to that is IP addresses. They go in the format of 4 sets of numbers. For example, 192.168.0.1. Now, as I said, they take 4 sets of numbers. The maximum number they can be is 255. And we know that 255 as a binary number has 8 bits, which is 1 byte. So 4 sets of them means an IP address uses 4 bytes. And that must mean that a MAC address uses 6 bytes. So it has 6 pairs of hexadecimal numbers. So for example, 76:6B:AC:10:24. We've already established that MAC addresses are written in hex from my previous statement, and IP addresses can be changed. Okay, that's really important. So you could connect to a network and get one IP address. You can leave that network, go back later in the day and get a completely different IP address. You can also make your IP addresses static if you don't want them to change. For example, if you had a server on a network and you always want it to be accessible from the same place. MAC addresses, on the other hand, cannot be changed. There is nothing you can do to change them. They are hard-coded when they've been manufactured. So that's the IP and MAC addressing activity. Now let's go on to the encryption activity. So it's a fill in the blanks, and we've got here a blank is used. Well, I'm going to go with algorithm is used to scramble data so that it can't be so that if it is accessed, it can't be, well, that's going to be understood. A key is required to decrypt or encrypt the data. Encrypted text then is called ciphertext, whereas data that's not been encrypted is called plain text. An example of encryption used in networks is the HTTPS protocol, which is used to securely transfer data over the internet. So that's used to display web pages more often than not. So we've got there, an algorithm is used to scramble data so that if it is accessed, it cannot be understood. A key is required to encrypt or decrypt that data. Encrypted text is called ciphertext, whereas data that has not been encrypted is called plain text. An example of encryption used in networks is the HTTPS protocol, which is used to securely transfer data over the internet. So that is IP addresses, MAC addresses, and encryption.
The last part of your lesson, you're going to complete some exam style questions. So there are 2 questions for you to complete. It's worth 6 marks in total. You've got 10 minutes to give them your best shot. Off you go. Hopefully you managed to complete those questions in time. Just remember, when we review questions, make sure you make any amendments to your answers if you need to. So over to Mr. Barnes to review those answers.
Okay, so let's have a little look at these exam questions as part of our deliberate practice on IP and MAC addresses. So we've got computers in a network can be identified using both IP and MAC addresses. Describe two differences between IP and MAC addresses. Okay, so 4 marks. So for 2 comparisons or two sets of differences, you'll get the marks here. So I'm going to start off with IP addresses can be changed and can be different on different networks. A MAC address cannot be changed. So that's one comparison. Now I need to make another. So I'm going to say IP addresses are written numbers in denary. MAC addresses use hexadecimal. So I've got 2 differences there. Okay. Moving on to the second question then, we've got explain how encryption may be used to protect documents on a network. Well, I will say encryption scrambles the data so that it cannot be read if intercepted. It uses special keys to encrypt or decrypt the data. Okay, so there's my answers. So we explained for 2 marks. We've sort of made a point and expanded and explained why, how it protects it. Okay, so let's go back to the first question. We've got 4 marks available. So there's lots of different points in the mark scheme here. So the first one is IP addresses can be changed, MAC addresses can't be changed. So that marries up with my first couple of points, which is IP addresses can be changed, 1 mark. A MAC address cannot be changed, 2 marks. If we keep looking, the second and third bullet points about the length, I've not mentioned that, but that's perfectly valid. The third set of bullet points is IP addresses are written in denary, MAC are written in hex, and for me they are the 2 most obvious differences. Let's have a look at the rest of the mark scheme though. So we've got IP addresses are configured by the software, the MAC address comes from the hardware. IP addresses are used for routing across a LAN or a WAN. MAC addresses are only used within IP addresses are used for routing across a WAN, but MAC addresses are only used for a LAN. Okay, but I think the most obvious ones there are 1 can be changed, 1 can't, and 1 uses denary and 1 uses hexadecimal. Okay, so for that question, I've got 4 marks. And then if I just sort of do it around the other way. So encryption, I had to explain how encryption may be used to protect documents. So I said encryption scrambles the data so that it cannot be read if intercepted. So the second bullet point here is it jumbles, scrambles, mixes up the data. Okay, if it's accessed it cannot be understood. So technically I've hit both of those points for 2 marks there. Okay, but I've also said it uses special keys to encrypt or decrypt the data, which is also a valid mark point. You could have also mentioned it uses an algorithm to do this, and that would have got you a mark as well. Either way, mine is worth 2 marks.
And that's what you need to know about IP, MAC addresses and encryption. Stay tuned for the next lesson. See you next time.